Well, here we are, our last week of this series on spiritual practices. And this is the day that we are going to finally talk about the contemplative practices. And these are the ones that are less about actions that you do and more about making yourself more available for God to do something with you, in you. So the first one I would call slowing down. Many of us are accustomed to rushing to accomplish as much as we possibly can. We're faced with calendars that are full and trying to cram as much in our day as we can. Or maybe that's just me, but that's a reality in my life. And so my spiritual word for the year is slow down. That means just being more deliberate and intentional. It means stopping to think and pray before adding more things or events or commitments to your life. And I think this is a really important spiritual practice. It's just this idea of slowing down. Many of these contemplative spiritual practices flow into each other and overlap. So you'll notice that as I talk through some of these. The second practice that I want to talk to you about is simply silence. Sometimes we don't like silence. We either need to be talking or listening to music or having the television on. We don't want to listen to our own thoughts, and we avoid silence as much as possible. And yet, God's primary language is silence. Silence is a place of deep listening to God. One of my favorite Christian writers is Thomas Merton, who was a monk. He has passed away now, but he has written a number of books that have been meaningful, and he talks a lot about silence. And so here are a couple of his quotes that I want to share with you. He says, "In silence, God ceases to be an object and becomes an experience." Another favorite quote is, "The deepest level of communication is not communication, but communion. It is wordless." We're accustomed to thinking about communion as that thing that we do on the first Sunday of the month, in which we take in the body and the blood of Christ. And that's an activity that we do to be in communion with Jesus and be grateful for the events of Easter and Lent. But there is a communion that happens, a joining, a being one with, that happens when you are in silence with God. And that's a very important distinction to make. And so the last one that I'll give you of a quote from Thomas Merton is, "The speech of God is silence. His word is solitude." And so we move into the practice of solitude, the practice of being alone with God. And that's another one of those places where some people can be really uncomfortable about being alone, about being by themselves. And yet it is how we encounter God. Sometimes we wonder who we are outside of our relationships with others and without being with other people. But Dwight Moody once said, "Character is what you are when you're alone in the dark." And I think that's very true. We come more to a sense of true self when we are alone. And especially when we are alone with God and learning who we are in God's sight, and how we can be true to that as we live out life with God. Solitude, I find, is the crucible of the soul. It's the place where we let go of our attachments to worldly values and possessions. It's where we discover the music of creation, and we hear God's word speaking to us in that quiet and aloneness that we experience in solitude. And so the third kind of aspect of this process of moving from silence to solitude ends with the listening. We're not always very good at listening to God. Silence isn't just about the absence of sound or thought. It is the act of listening and receiving God's word for you. Just as we discussed when we were talking about Vizio Divina, and the idea that the Bible can speak directly to us. It's not just an ancient book that was written to and for the Israelites and the followers of Christ. It's a book for us today, and can speak directly to us. And so the same goes for being in silence and actively listening for God. And God might not give you actual words, but you might receive a sense of comfort or reassurance or a nudge to move in a certain direction, to feel a calling, a sense of something that God has in store for you. We just have to make time for that so that we can listen. So in that silence, in that solitude, and in that listening is how we come to a greater sense of God's presence with us and his words for us. Another spiritual practice that we would consider a contemplative practice is Vizio Divina. So instead of Lectio Divina, which is divine reading, Vizio Divina would be divine seeing. Seeing God in images, seeing God in the world around us, whether that's photographs or artwork or just God's creation. But looking at the beauty around you and listening for God in that. So you might start with some of your photographs that you've taken on vacations, to beautiful places, and just look at them and pick one in particular that has particularly struck you, and then just take in the whole of the image. Take in this photograph in its entirety and let it kind of sink in. And then you might want to notice a particular part of the image that shimmers for you, that really draws your attention away from the entirety of the photo to this one particular part. And then listening for the message that God might have for you in that image. Early in the COVID crisis, when everything was pretty panicky and scary, and so many different things were happening, and I was feeling like I was being tossed around in a storm. It was pretty crazy. And I went down, we have a creek that abuts our property, and I went down and sat by the creek, and it's kind of in the trees, in the pine trees down there. And I was looking at the trees, and I just kind of was thinking, how do these trees handle the storms? How do they go from a still, quiet day one day to blustery, stormy day the next? And I felt like the trees were telling me, we have deep roots. And that was an encouragement to me to put down roots into God's word and God's presence and get myself so grounded that I didn't feel so tossed about by the ups and downs of this life that we were experiencing at that time. So that's one way to do Vizio Divina, and I just encourage you to experiment with that. And like when you're going on a hike, you can just sit and look at some beautiful part of creation. We've got so much beauty here. And sit and take it in see it in a holy way and listen for what God might have to say to you through that image. And through all of these different practices, they might draw you into a desire to record your thoughts, to journal, to write down any realizations or insights, anything that you learned from this time of being alone with God. And or it could be Thanksgiving that you write down. But journaling can be one way to sort of solidify what you have received during your time with all of these spiritual practices. And the last one I'm going to talk about is self-emptying, which we talked about a little bit last week when we were talking about fasting. And the Greek word for self-emptying is kenosis. And kenosis is this idea that we need to clean out the closets of our hearts and our brain and make space for God. One professor that I learned from years ago asked us what it might be like to metaphorically empty the tomb to make ready for Christ's body. And so as we prepare our hearts right now in this time of Lent to be ready and make room for Jesus, we think about this idea of emptying. How do we prepare for the events of Holy Week, this week that changed the world? What do we need to make room for the risen Christ? How do we clear out the clutter that is sometimes the way we live life, the activities, and just that sense of clearing the decks to make room for something new, something important, and something spiritual that God might have in store for you. And so the thing for me about these practices and why I love them so much is that God is never done with us. I don't care how old you are or how young you are. God is never done with using your life to do God's work in the world. And so when we sit still, when we be alone, when we sit in silence, when we actively listen for God's word for us, then we receive from God so much. We receive guidance and love and care and God's desire to just be in relationship with us. And that is the beauty of these practices. I hope you will try them. I will create another handout if you will just let me know. I'm also going to put together some reflection questions that maybe cover all of the different things that we've learned over the last 5 weeks, so that you can take this deeper. You can be thinking about all of the different practices and what appeals to you, what feels the most comfortable or natural, what feels a little uncomfortable, and then therefore maybe the one that you should try. But just I hope that you find this class to have been a way of you learning new ways of being in relationship with God that make your life spiritually deeper and wider than you thought it could be before. So blessings on this season of Lent for you. Blessings on all of you. I miss you. And I'm glad I could be with you in this way, at least for now. God bless you and hopefully see you soon. Bye-bye.